Welcome to The Explainer. We're going to jump right in today because we are exploring a deeply fascinating synthesis of Jungian psychology and Nietzschean philosophy. Now, I want you to imagine me stepping into the role of your clinical analyst here as we examine this incredibly powerful looming metaphor, the Black Knight. And just to be clear, we aren't looking at some simple black and white fable of good and evil today. We are clinically examining the alchemical vessel of the soul itself. So let's begin our descent.
Right off the bat, as you approach the metaphorical bridge of self-actualization, you probably carry a specific reason for your existence. Maybe it's a rigid logical structure or a really strict moral law. But why? Well, as Nietzsche noted in his work, The Gay Science, humans are fundamentally terrified of purposelessness. Actually, here's a wild psychological fact. In clinical studies, people will often choose to administer literal electric shocks to themselves rather than just sit alone in an empty room with their own thoughts. It's crazy, but we construct these incredibly rigid dogmas simply to avoid facing the sheer vacuum at the center of being. We would literally rather will nothingness than not will at all.
Moving into Act 1, the vacuum of being. This sets up the absolute necessity of the great no before any kind of self-creation can actually begin.
So here's the thing, you simply cannot argue with a vacuum. When you encounter the archetype of the Black Knight, you are actually encountering your own horror vacui, that profound, paralyzing fear of empty space. He forces you to abruptly stop looking outward for meaning. Whether you're looking to a higher power or pure logic, he makes you realize that you have to become the primary source of meaning yourself. He is the terrifying, unyielding reality that there is absolutely no script written for you in the stars.
That brings us to Act 2, the psychic mirror. Let's descend a bit deeper and examine the knight's polished, midnight surface strictly through the Jungian lens of projection.
The dynamic of projection at play here is just brilliant. When raw, instinctual desires, which we're representing as the wolf, strike the knight, the wolf is really just hitting its own cruelty. And when the rigid, rule-bound inquisitor strikes him, the inquisitor is just hitting his own intolerance. It's a classic psychological defense. We fundamentally hate in others what we flat-out refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. The knight doesn't actually fight back at all. He just holds the mirror steady until your ego violently shatters against its own secret fears.
Take a second and really reflect on that. As your Jungian analyst, I have to challenge you. What exactly are you projecting onto the void? Because the defining characteristic of the true knight is that eventually he stops hitting the glass. He lowers his weapon, and he actively embraces that dark reflection as a totally necessary part of himself.
Okay, Act 3, Forge of Moral Law. Enter the Pale Inquisitor. But remember, we have to look at him as a clinical personification of moral utility, not a literal divine servant. We can essentially dissect the Inquisitor's laws through three distinct parables to see their true evolutionary utility. First, think about the lead ledger. The traveler believes their sins are a debt to a god, but practically speaking, those heavy rules are an evolutionary anchor. You need that weight to walk the thin, precarious wire of human civilization. Second, we have the divine scourge. The Inquisitor thinks he's purifying the wolf through pain, but what he's really doing is providing the harsh friction needed to forge a sovereign will out of blind animal instinct. And finally, the frozen throne. It demands absolute stillness, which, let's be honest, is really just a mythological shelter for the fragile mind. These laws aren't divine truth sent from above. They are highly practical tools for survival. You see, when the Inquisitor shouts out, "I punish the beast to save the man," he is entirely missing the point. Striking the silver wolf with a scourge doesn't magically erase the beast. It just breeds a cold, deeply focused hatred. You cannot beat base instinct out of a person. It has to be melted down in the knight's alchemical vessel, right? That's where the literal lash transforms into a rain, and raw, destructive hunger is forged into a directed, purposeful drive.
Moving on to Act 4, Frozen Throne versus Dark Burden. This is where we hit the ultimate clash between the desire for blind obedience and sovereign self-creation.
Look at the stark contrast in how we try to handle the pure chaos of existence. On one hand, you have the Inquisitor's frozen throne, which is essentially a desperate attempt to mask the will to power behind this facade of absolute law and artificial stillness. On the other hand, the Black Knight offers the burden of darkness, and this is a radical offering of acceptance. It completely shatters the ice of absolute law and asks you to actually carry the weight of your own existence, rather than just outsourcing it to some rigid external dogma. Which brings us to the incredible Nietzschean concept of amor fati, the love of fate. To really absorb this philosophy is to stop wishing the past were any different than it was. You take your trauma, your shadows, and your mistakes, and you wear them as armor, and that gives you a profound sense of weight. It anchors you so you aren't just blown away into the psychic wilderness the second things get tough. In a very real sense, you are grounded by your regrets rather than paralyzed by them.
And finally, Act 5, Birth of the Sovereign. This is the grim rebirth, stepping into the Gothic womb of the Übermensch, where the old struggle finally ends.
Let's dive into this third way. Traditional morality usually tells us we only have two choices: either kill the wolf and suppress all desire, or obey the Inquisitor and blindly follow the rules. But the synthesized sovereign achieves true transcendence through inclusion. As the ultimate psychological guide, the true knight integrates the primal id, the conscious ego, and the moral superego. Think about it. He doesn't kill the wolf, he gives it the Inquisitor's strict direction. He doesn't throw away the seneschal's logic, he gives it the wolf's raw fire. He uses the incredibly heavy burden of the law as stabilizing ballast, allowing him to master the storm completely without fear.
And the fascinating part is that this process doesn't just end. It transforms into the kinetic memory of the soul. You can think of the Black Knight archetype as the black box of your soul's flight. It stores the intense heat and energy of absolutely every conflict you've ever endured. You see, you don't leave the past behind at the Iron Bridge. You carry the bridge with you. Your internal light is continuously being generated by that lifelong friction between your animal instinct and your civilized mind.
Which leaves us with the absolute ultimate test of your sovereignty, Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence. Imagine your life, your struggles, and your deepest internal wars repeating infinitely, over and over again forever. Looking into the vacuum one last time, you have to ask yourself, are you merely surviving the friction, or are you actually using it to define your own light? Would you be proud of the knight you became? Thank you so much for joining me on the bridge for this explainer. Keep questioning the reflection in the mirror, and I'll catch you next time.